That's where the debate about, it almost always seems to go in relation to the British Empire at the moment.
Okay.
It's destaturing. It's Livingstone, in Edinburgh, apparently worked in a cotton mill when he was 10 years old, and that might have used cotton that was produced by slave labour.
Yes.
Well, if he was working at the age of 10, he wasn't exactly enjoying a good life himself, but he went on later to become a major figure in the abolitionist movement.
Of course.
So my point is, that's where everyone goes when they want to paint the British Empire as having been terrible. It kept slaves. It did for a couple of 100 years, and it was hideous and terrible. But every other regime, and I would argue even today, we forget this, there are more slaves now than ever in the world, still. And they don't seem to stir up anywhere like the degree of passion and concern that they ought to.
No, you're quite right. So from about 1650 till just after 1800, the British, not the government, but the British were involved in the Atlantic slave trade.
A very brutal and frightful slave trade.
Yes, it was.
Made possible, of course, by people selling people of their own race in the first place.
The British traders, slave traders, like the other Europeans, arrived on the coast of West Africa. And they didn't go far inland. The slaves were brought to them by other Africans who had enslaved them and sold them. Let's remember, Africans were involved in the slave trade before they got to the coast. And in fact, Africans had been involved in trading slaves with to the Roman Empire and under the subsequent Muslim empires too. So yes, the British were involved in slavery and the slave trade, but then in 1807, the British Empire abolished the trade, and in 1833 abolished slavery throughout the empire, and that made Britain the first major power in the history of the world to abolish the trade and the institution, and to spend the next 150 years of its existence until it dissolved in suppressing slavery in Brazil, across the Atlantic, throughout Africa, and David Livingstone was a major opponent of slavery in southern Africa, and India and Malaysia. There are a couple of American political scientists who have said that this was the most costly moral international endeavor in the history of the world. And
perhaps the most outstanding human rights movement of all times.
Well, absolutely, because it was done in the name of a Christian belief in the basic human equality of all races under God, and the right of all people to be treated in a decent fashion, regardless of skin color.
And this campaign was largely led by people who are now really demonised. They were well-to-do white males, often backed, of course, by some wonderful women, the very sort of people now that many elites would say are to be despised, the sort of people that you are responsible for racism and for every evil you could think of.
Yes. It's true that there were freed blacks who were involved in the campaign to abolish slavery in England. Olaudah Equiano was a famous one. His memoirs of being a slave were published by one of Wilberforce's colleagues. So blacks were involved, but it was primarily because Britain in those days was overwhelmingly, as it remains overwhelmingly, a white population. So if slavery was to be abolished, particularly in Parliament, white people had to do it. White men had to do it, but they did it. And that's the strange thing in the current climate that everyone, well, those on the so-called woke left want us to remember the awful evils of slavery, but to forget what's happened between then and now. And that's just it's perverse, frankly.
Well, it leads our young people in a situation where they only hear one side of the narrative to a loathing of their own culture. In an age when, if we value freedom, we need to stand up for our culture. That seems to me to be really quite important.
Absolutely, and I think that goes back to the very reason I wrote this book, John, that any human history is going to be a mixture of right and wrong, good and evil. But the history of the British Empire in many respects is a history of increasing good. We did slavery, we repudiated it, and then we couldn't undo the past, but we did the next best thing, which was to try and stop other people indulging in the same thing. And
many white Royal Navy sailors lost their lives.
Yes, they did.
And yet, the critical theory movement would say that all whites are racist.
Yes.
And only whites are racist.
Yes.
It doesn't stack up. And the point in all of this is not to whitewash the bad things, but it's to balance it so that people can, amongst other things, recognise that if there is something that needs adjusting, no better than a liberal participatory democracy in which to make that change. Much harder to influence change if something's going wrong or there are injustices in an autocratic regime. And we ought to, I think, be much prouder of our own liberalism.
No, I agree, and I think that's why the historical debate is so important. That we retain faith in the liberal democracies we have built, because they do have a long history of liberal humanitarian endeavour, with originally and significantly Christian inspiration.